Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for getting on. We'll wait just a little bit to try and catch all the stragglers in the next minute or so, and then we'll get running with Sean to run us through some brake education here. All right, looks like a few people trickling in, but looks like we're kind of stabilized on the people jumping in. So we won't take up too much time just waiting around. When I'll hand it over to Sean to get us going. Please use the Q&A for any questions, and if they're we'll pass those on to Sean to try and get answered as much as we can. If not, if you don't get an answer, we'll try to reach out afterwards or individually. And if you don't get either of those, please reach out to us and to your sales contact, and we'll try and make sure any questions get answered. We don't want anything unanswered for you guys. That's what we're here for. And again, happy to have Sean with us to really get us up to speed. Really appreciate all you guys taking your time on this Friday to join us, and hopefully we can make it worth your while. I know Sean always has good stuff to share. So with that, I will hand it over.
All right, thanks, Matt. I'm going to get everything queued up here. Like Matt said, we're going to spend the next hour talking about brakes. Just going to get my presentation queued up. I'm going to start with a presentation, then we're going to jump off the presentation, take a look at some things under the camera, and then I'm also going to navigate to some technical resources that are going to make your lives easier that you can find access to on our various websites here. But everyone's seeing my presentation? All right, awesome. So as mentioned, my name is Sean Owen. I'm a technical field guide with SRAM. I'm based in Bentonville, Arkansas. And I'm just happy to be here with you. So over the top of your screen, you're going to see a couple icons. You've got a chat icon, a Q&A icon. If you've got questions as we go through this, again, drop those in that chat. You know, the goal here is to make this as interactive as possible and really get you guys the most possible out of your time here today. And so again, we're going to review our flat bar brake lineup. We're going to talk about some tools you can use that are going to help you grow your brake service business to better serve your riders. And so without further ado, let's drive on in here. And it's worth talking about our brake lineup because we really had a whole bunch of changes. Just 2 years ago, we had 27 different models of brakes. We had dot fluid brakes. We had mineral oil brakes. And last year, we were actually able to reduce that down to 10 models in the aftermarket. There's actually 11 models total if we count an OE only brake. So it's definitely time to review what our lineup is and kind of how we got here. And so 4 years ago, we launched our first ever mineral oil brake. It was the DB8. And rather than starting with kind of an ultra premium brake, we actually aimed squarely at the value side of the spectrum. And man, that brake just knocked it out of the park for us. It was spec'd on a lot of OE bikes. It became a go-to replacement with shops, and people just really loved the power and the value of that brake. And so that led us to expand that mineral oil project to the point where we actually only have mineral oil brakes in the flat bar part of our lineup. And so how do we go from being a brand that was really synonymous with dot fluid to switching our entire flat bar lineup over to mineral oil? And it kind of has to do with some of the things that were going on behind the scenes with some other parts of the business. So we like dot fluid for a number of reasons. Dot fluid being readily available, right? The dot 5.1 you buy in the little 4-ounce bottles from us is the same as the dot 5.1 you can get on the shelf at AutoZone or Walmart or wherever. So the ready availability we really liked about dot fluid. We also like that dot fluid has a very high starting boiling point. But one of the downsides of dot fluid is dot fluid is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs moisture from the air. And once dot fluid gets to 4% moisture absorption, it's considered no longer safe to use and it needs to be disposed of. Hence that 1-year service interval we required on our dot fluid brakes. So some upsides in the availability and the high boiling point, some downsides in terms of the service intervals that were required. So we redid our RockShox lineup in 2023, partnering with Maxima. They came up with all the fluids for us for that lineup. And we also partnered with Maxima to come up with a mineral oil for our brakes. And we know that mineral oil, unlike dot fluid, is a proprietary product. The mineral oil that our competitors are using in their brakes are not cross-compatible across their brakes. and the mineral oil we use is not cross-compatible with those products. So it is a proprietary product, but because it's a proprietary product, it can be engineered just the way we want it, and it does what we were looking to do. And so Maxima was kind of the key piece that we needed to get that mineral oil system. And as a result of that mineral oil system, we've got a high boiling point that approaches DOT fluid's boiling point, but without the moisture absorption. And we were able to extend that 1-year service interval to a 2-year service interval. And the other kind of key piece of the mineral oil thing is it's not actually the boiling of the fluid where the failure happens in mineral oil brakes. We test a lot of mineral oil brakes, both ours and our competitors, and the failure point in most brakes is actually the seals at the caliper. The type of seals that get along with mineral oil versus the type of seals that get along with DOT fluid, that's the failure point in a lot of mineral oil brakes. And to do a mineral oil brake lineup changeover, we came up with a proprietary composition mineral oil seal. And that's why we were able to switch that whole lineup over. We don't have that failure we see at the caliper in other systems. And so that's kind of the why. And before we talk too much about the individual models, I want to review some real basic things and just kind of talk about some key features. And that way, when we run through the lineup, we can understand what differentiates model to model. And so one of the things that differentiates our brakes from model to model is on a higher end, our brakes are going to feature a matchmaker or an MMX mount. And what that simply means is that we've got a mounting point for that brake lever on the handlebar that allows that lever to be ambidextrous in conjunction with a bleed port on either side, meaning if you mount it on the right-hand side, it's a right lever, and if you mount it on the left-hand side, it's a left lever. That matchmaker mount also allows us to mount a shifter or a dropper lever on that same clamp, giving us a nice, tidy, clean cockpit. On the value side of the spectrum, we go to a split ring clamp. Those levers are not going to be ambidextrous. You're going to see the bleed port is actually at the bottom of the lever. And when you bleed that brake, you're going to want to make sure that bleed port is at the top of the system. So that's going to be a differentiator you see. And those split ring clamp brake levers are not ambidextrous. You can see that this is always going to be a right-hand lever. The other left-hand lever is going to be the mirror of that. So that's one differentiator. Another differentiator you're going to see is we're going to use bearings at the top end for the pivot. Bearing, we're going to roll on stainless steel ball bearings. It's going to have a smoother action. It's going to have a longer service life. And it's also going to be very easy to service and replace that. HLC sells our tool to do the bearing replacement as well as the replacement bearings. You got that rider who's on kind of 2-year or 3-year service life of that brake. It's a nice service you could do to revive that brake lever feel and kind of give it a new lease on life. And on the more value side of the spectrum, we use a plastic bushing as that pivot. It's not going to be as smooth of an action as that bearing. So that's another differentiator as we work through that lineup. All of our mineral oil brakes are going to feature a reach adjustment. And what a reach adjustment is simply where does that brake lever sit at rest relative to the handlebar. It's going to have no impact on brake function, and it's entirely rider preference. And where the difference is our higher end brakes are going to have a tool-free reach adjustment, meaning you're not going to need a tool. You just grab your fingers and you can adjust that lever position. And at the value side, it's going to require a 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench to do that reach adjustment. So always a reach adjustment. It's just how it's achieved. Now let's get a little more technical as we get into the interior of the brake. One adjustment that some of our brakes are going to feature is a contact adjustment. And this is actually going to affect brake function. What contact adjustment does is it varies the point at which that brake lever is going to feel firm. So kind of that bite point of that brake. Do I want my brake to pull really short before it engages, or do I want it to pull longer? Again, it's entirely rider preference. And what's happening here is there's no change at the caliper. The pads are always going to sit at the same distance from the rotor. What we're doing is we're varying the starting position of that piston in the lever. The more quickly it closes off those reservoir ports, the shorter the lever throw. The longer it takes to close off those reservoir ports, the longer the throw. So entirely a rider preference thing, but if a rider wants that ability to adjust that, they're going to want to brake with contact adjustment. And another change that came to our lineup over the past 2 years is stealth routing. We've introduced that. If we think about what brake levers looked like up until a few years ago, those hoses kind of exited towards the front tire and then arced back towards the bike. They would line up with the cables and housings. We wanted that nice, efficient routing for cables and housings to not have much friction. But with riders switching over to axis bikes and having those nice, clean cockpits with electric shifting, no more wires, we adjusted our brake lever shape to route the housing in a more clean path. And we sort of have two different ways we do this. In the kind of version 1, what you see in that upper left-hand corner, those hoses are going to go towards the stem. It's going to get along really well with bikes that use headset cable routing, regardless of how you feel about that kind of setup. And then we've got our version 2, where it's actually just going to run parallel to the bar. Both of these bikes are going to get along with any kind of routing, but if you got the headset routing, that version 1 is probably your better choice. And all of the mineral oil brakes are going to feature one or other of these. We've moved away from that kind of traditional housing routing. And with our mechanical transmission, we actually kind of mirrored what we've done with that Stealth version 2 routing here. So even riders riding mechanical bikes can have nice, clean cockpits. So a really dialed looking cockpit, even if you've got a mechanical bike. Go back to the lever internals. And here's another key thing that I think often gets missed when talking about our brakes. We use two different kind of pivot technologies in the lever that result in really different feels and really different rider experiences. In our direct link brakes, the push rod is acting directly from the lever to the piston. So it's a very linear path. No matter where you are in the lever stroke, you're going to get the same amount of output relative to your input, and it's going to be really light off the top. The other technology we use is a SwingLink, and you can see that red cam in that system. So in this, lever is acting on the cam. As that cam arcs, it acts on the push rod. So what we're going to end up with here with a SwingLink is we're going to end up with a very progressive brake lever feel. The deeper you are in the stroke, the more output you get relative to the input. So it's going to have a very strong ramp up. It might feel a little firmer off the top because of that cam, but more power deeper in the stroke. So two very different riding experiences. And then the other technology here I want to talk about, but before we talk about it, I want to talk about brake bleeding. We make road levers with mechanical shifting. We make road levers with electronic shifting, all of which use dot fluid. You can see in the image here. We make flat bar brakes with mineral oil, and we make flat bar brakes that use dot fluid, or we used to at least. So my question to you is, how many different SRAM bleed procedures are there? And I'd love for you to drop your guess in the chat if you happen to know it. See if anyone gets the right answer. And I'm going to take a drink.
Yeah, quick, you'll have to go do it in the Q&A because we've got chat cut off, so everything's going through the Q&A. So if you're
okay,
going to get in
thanks
touch,
for the correction.
do it that way. But I'm watching, so if anybody wants to put an answer, I'll share.
All right. Well, the correct answer is 2. There are 2 different bleed procedures, and it's not whether it's road or mountain. It's not whether it's dot fluid or mineral oil. It has to do with the technology going on in the caliper, and this is going to be a key differentiator for our brakes. In 2017, we introduced bleeding edge technology, and bleeding edge technology is a change in the caliper that results in a different bleed process. It makes your life as a technician much, much easier. So taking a look at that brake on the left, what we see is our bleed port is at the top of the caliper in line with the hose. And so when we bleed that brake, we want to get air bubbles out of our system, and our air bubbles need to come out of our system by us pressurizing and vacuuming it. The air bubbles want to hang onto the back of those pistons. So it's going to take some extra steps to bleed that. With our bleeding edge brake on the right-hand side, we've got a bleeding port at the bottom. So when we bleed that brake, we're just going to push fluid from the top. It's going to go from the top through the bottom. And it's going to be a much quicker to that air out of that system. But it's not simply moving where the bleed port is. It's actually the architecture inside the caliper. So there's a transfer port across the top on both of these brakes, but the bleeding edge brake gets a transfer port across the bottom, which results in a much cleaner path of fluid, a much faster bleed process. And when we bleed the bleeding edge brake, we actually start with clean fluid at the top, which means that dirty fluid never leaves our caliper. So it's a big changeover for us. It's on all of our mineral oil brakes. It's going to result in a much faster bleed for your technicians versus pretty much any other system out there. So that's going to be a big key differentiator in the technology we use. And bleeding edge kind of comes in 2 varieties. At the upper end of the spectrum, we're going to use a bleeding edge fitting that's going to interface with your bleed kit syringe. It's going to have that red fitting for dot or a green fitting for mineral oil. And at the value end of the spectrum, it's still going to be bleeding edge process. You're just going to use a traditional syringe to do that bleed. It's another key differentiator, and that's what that bleeding edge fitting looks like. It's going to be used in all of our mineral oil brakes. There's only one brake in our lineup that does not feature bleeding edge technology, and that is our Apex brake, and we do that because we wanted to hit such an aggressive price with that. We used a less expensive caliper technology. So really only 2 different bleed procedures. If you're unfamiliar with either of those bleed procedures, don't hesitate to reach out and get you connected with some education. I've got colleagues who work out of video studios just like this across the country. We'd love to give you some education on how to properly bleed those brakes if you need a refresher. And so one of the changes, yes?
Yeah, quick question on that one. We got a good one. Is the rear caliper required to be removed with the bleeding edge procedure?
No need to remove the caliper on those. But great timely question, man. It was almost like that was queued up perfectly. So we introduced a new step in our mineral oil bleed process. We introduced the piston massage. It's actually something we've sort of been recommending in training, but not in our manuals over the past couple of years. We would suggest putting 2 rotors together, removing your pads, putting those rotors in there, advancing your pistons, cleaning those pistons, drying those pistons, not lubricating those pistons, and then pushing them back in to get nice, even piston movement. With our mineral oil brakes, specifically the Maven, which has such large pistons, we actually want you to advance those pistons to get those seals nice and exercised and moving consistently as part of a finishing step in a bleed. We can also do it when we change pads. We can do it as a kind of lever feel improvement process in between bleeds. And that piston massage spacer is going to come in the new V3 bleed kit. HLC also has these as a standalone part. I believe it's like $3 your cost. So, you know, a pretty easy thing to have at every single workstation. And when I do this process, it does actually make it easier to remove the caliper from the bleed process. Couple of questions here I want to address while we're talking it through. So do we need to remove the rear caliper at the bleeding edge? No need to remove the bleeding edge or caliper when we do the bleed. The bleeding edge system means that we don't have to have the caliper pointed or the bleed port pointed down. Another question about caliper pistons removable for service. Yes, we offer service kits for our brakes. The caliper, the mineral oil kits are still serviceable. So we do offer service kits, and those are actually removable as well. All right, carrying on here, and back to that story again. We mentioned we had a big reduction in models. Let's kind of look at that lineup and how to navigate that lineup. Because when you get your stuff on the sales floor, you want to have them a nice, easy way to navigate who's the right rider for which brake. And so how do we go from 27 models to 10? Well, part of it we cheated. If you think about cross-country racing, riders are not asking for 2-piston brakes anymore. Cross-country racing has just dramatically changed. I always like to use the example of the Rio Olympics, where they were kind of riding around a dirt circle, versus the XC Racing World Cup we saw last year, where it was just some amazing courses, some real technical riding. Pretty much none of the pros are asking for 2-piston brakes anymore. They want more power. They're willing to pay a little bit of a weight penalty for that power. And we're seeing regular riders ask for the same thing. So we eliminated 2-piston brakes. These are all going to be 4-piston brakes. So that helped us shrink the lineup. And the other way we did it is we tried to divide the lineup into 2 kind of categories. We're going to ask the rider, do you want lighter weight with still trail capability? And the lighter weight rider is going to want motive. Do you want maximum power? You're going to want Maven. And then we've got our DB brakes for riders looking for that value option. And so let's run through the individual brakes and kind of talk about how to differentiate features. So starting with Maven, our most powerful brake, all of the Maven brakes are going to have that Stealth V2 routing. They're all going to have a bleeding edge fitting at the caliper. They're all going to have tool-free reach adjustment. So at 330 per brake, you've got titanium hardware, contact point adjustment, a SwingLink, a bearing lever pivot, an aluminum lever, and a banjo fitting at the caliper. Jumping on down to silver, at 290 per brake, you've got black anode finish. You get all the features of Ultimate, but we go to a stainless steel hardware versus titanium, and that's really your only difference between those two. On the bronze, this is our OE only option. It loses the contact adjustment, and it goes from a banjo at the caliper to a double compression fitting. So that's the OE only option, and at the aftermarket, our entry level point into the Maven story is Maven Base, which is 205 per brake. It's really the same features as Maven Bronze, right? The bushing pivot, the double compression hose, still has bleeding edge, but there are some key differences that with Maven Base that are worth talking about. Unlike all the other Mavens, which use a SwingLink, Maven Base actually uses a direct link. So it's going to have a power just like the other Mavens, but it's going to have a distinctly different lever feel. It's going to be a much more linear lever feel. The other Mavens use a 19.5 and an 18 millimeter piston in the caliper, whereas Maven Base uses 4 18 millimeter pistons. And so it has a little less power at the top end of the stroke. It's really the difference between running maybe a 2 millimeter thick rotor and a 1.8 millimeter thick rotor. And so we were kind of surprised, despite Maven's Base being kind of value-oriented part of the spectrum, it actually ended up on a lot of best of the year lists. There are certain riders who just, preferred that direct link feel versus the SwingLink. So if you've got that rider who, maybe didn't love Maven right off the bat, this can be another option where you've got that rider on that same kind of power, but with just a different lever feel. So talking about motives, if Maven's the choice for riders for maximum power, this is our choice for riders looking for lighter weight. And so Motive kind of basically condenses what was our level 4-piston brake and our code brake. So we have power just like codes, which, to remind you, before Maven existed, that was our DH bike. It's won DH World Cups. It's won Red Bull Rampage. We've got that kind of almost that same level of power, but with weight just a little heavier than what level 4-piston was. And we do that at 3 different tiers. At the ultimate tier, it's a direct link brake. They're all going to be direct link. There's not going to be contact adjustment for weight savings, and they're going to feature that stealth V1 routing right towards the stem. And they're all going to have a bleeding edge fitting at the caliper. At the ultimate level, it's 305 per wheel, carbon lever blade, titanium hardware, lever bearings, and a banjo at the caliper. At the silver level, we go to an aluminum lever blade and stainless steel hardware, but all the other features remain the same. And at the bronze level, we go to bushings at the lever and a compression nut at the caliper at 195 per wheel. So talked about the more power, talked about the lighter weight. Let's talk about the value side of the spectrum, right? That DB8 was kind of the start of mineral oil brakes for us. Great power at a great price. And we decided to extend that family with 2 new models. And so this is a really easy story to remember. The DB8s and the DB6 and the DB4 all share the same hose and the same caliper. All that's different across these brakes is the lever. So taking a look at the lever difference here, our DB6 features a cutaway. The DB6 and DB4 both feature split ring clamps. The DB6 has a cutout in its split ring that allows us to run an MMX shifter or dropper. The DB4 doesn't, so you'll need to run a single split ring clamp lever or dropper on there. That's really the only difference between those two. And it is a $20 difference in price between those two. So just kind of an amazing lineup. At the DB8, you've got 150, the DB6 105, and the DB4 is an $85 brake at retail. And so really it is just that difference. And one thing I want to bring up to you that HLC stocks the DB8 levers as a standalone. If a rider got the DB6 and the DB4, they want to upgrade to that DB8 feel, they can swap out that lever if they choose. Rider going down the trail blindfolded isn't going to notice the difference between these. It's really the same caliper, same lever technology. It's just the lever architecture externally is a little different to save some cost. And I really think, while Motives and Mavens are exciting, I think the DB series has got a lot of opportunity for you and your customers. When I think about, the brakes that are showing up on some of the entry-level e-bikes and EMTBs in the market, I think of all the brakes that showed up on all those COVID bikes, these woefully underpowered brakes from manufacturers. It's hard to find brake pads and support parts for. We got a lot of brakes out in the market that are looking for more braking power, more confidence. And the DB series is really poised to kind of answer that. And the other thing I'd bring up there is, there are less expensive brakes out there, but if your go-to replacement brake is a 2-piston brake, it's probably time to reconsider that and make a 4-piston brake your go-to service option. And I think the DB4 has got a strong case for it. And so let me run through kind of the why of why I think DB should be your go-to one. It's going to use the same bleed kit you're going to use for your Motives and Mavens. There's no new tools if you've got our mineral oil bleed kit. You're going to use the same SRAM Maximum mineral oil. It's the same brake pad you've been using for years with code. It's the same stealth majig hose and barb and compression fitting you've been using for all of our brakes. And it's the same hoses. And because we're using bleeding edge technology, it's going to be a much faster install, and your technicians are going to be practiced on that procedure. So while it certainly does land a little north of some of the other competitors on the market, I think it's got a compelling case as a go-to replacement brake. All right, so there's that lineup once again. Hopefully it's a really easy to understand lineup. We eliminated the 2-piston brakes, and we also eliminated a lot of overlap. We offer a whole lot of rotors and a whole lot of pads. And so our philosophy is that, by offering fewer models, we can hit the same amount of rider needs. And by using the pads and rotors to dial in that rider experience, and we can really fine tune that brake for a need by using less models. And what that ultimately means is it's an opportunity for you guys to set the rider up with the right brakes for their particular needs. So when we're starting the conversation, again, it's do you want lighter weight or do you want more power? And I'm going to kill the presentation here and switch over to my camera and take a look at some stuff. Just checking the questions here to see if we have any more. All right, I am spotlighted. I'm going to switch my camera on over here. Sweet, let's talk rotors. So we offer a number of rotors here for the mountain bike side of things. We've got an HS2 rotor, we've got a center line rotor, and then we've got a center line center lock rotor meant to grab a center line X rotor, which uses an aluminum carrier. But in any case, when we can think about our rotors like this, our center line rotors are going to be 1.85 millimeters thick. If we have a center line X rotor, it's going to have an aluminum carrier, which is going to save weight, but the actual characteristics of the rotor are going to be the same. So that's our 1.85 millimeter rotor option. On the HS2 side of things, we have a 2 millimeter thick rotor, significantly thicker rotor. We have heat dissipating paint on these spines. And these are kind of our two choices we're thinking about when it comes to brakes. The rotors that our rider's bike came with are probably just the rotors they have on there because that's what a product manager in Colorado, a product manager in California, a product manager in Wisconsin decided was appropriate for that brake. It may not be appropriate for that rider. So we've got some opportunities at the service counter to dial in that rider's brake experience. So we need to be asking questions about, how is your brake working for you? Do you have enough power? Do you want more power? Do you not have enough power? And we can dial in that brake response by manipulating these factors. So obviously these are two different size rotors. By going up a rotor size, we increase brake power by about 14%. So this being a 160 millimeter rotor, if I put a 180 millimeter rotor on that rider's bike, that's about a 14% increase in brake power. Let's say we need even more than that, but 180 is the biggest we can run on that rider's bike. Well, if I go from a 180 center line to 180 HS2, that's about a 7% increase in brake power. So by manipulating rotor size and rotor type, we can dial in brake power. And we don't necessarily just want to keep going up because some riders don't want more power. We actually might want a smaller rotor to get a better response. So how are we determining whether a rotor is big enough? Well, we're having a good conversation with that rider, right? You know your rider. You know what it's like to ride in your area. You're having good conversations with them, but we can also look at that rotor to make a determination. So hopefully this shows up on camera. It's a little hard with the light, but this is a paceline rotor. And this paceline rotor, when I take a look at it from the side, you can kind of see it's got some kind of bronzing to it, right? It's not just silver like this one here. This is nice and silver, never been ridden, whereas this one has kind of a bronzish color to it. You might look at that and say that's not good, but that's actually ideal. We're actually looking for a bronzish color. I'm going to see it on the top here. I'm going to see it over here. What that tells me is that this rotor is getting nice and hot, and we actually want some heat in the system. If a rotor comes in looking like this, it tells me my rotor is actually not ever getting hot enough. If we plot the coefficient of friction versus heat, what we see is we see a ramp and then a cliff. If we get to the point where we've got our rotor too hot, we go off of that cliff. But if we get a rotor that's not getting hot enough, we don't go up that ramp and we don't get good braking power. So a rotor that has this kind of brownish color is getting into that optimal window of the coefficient of friction and getting really good braking response. And if you've ever done like kind of lift access mountain biking, you've probably had this experience where at the top, your brakes aren't responding that great. You get partway down the slope and your brakes just feel dialed. You feel like you're in the zone, and because you're in the sweet spot of that coefficient of friction. So taking a look at our rotor colors is going to really help me dial that in. And there's some resources I'm going to show you in just a second. See some questions are popping up here. All right. Let's keep talking about this rotor for just 2 seconds and I'll come back to those questions. So taking a look at the rotor, we also want to measure those rotors for thickness. If you've seen, our new bleed kit comes with a Maven pad spacer. That Maven pad spacer has 3 cutouts. One of those cutouts is 1.5 millimeters, 1.55 millimeters thick. That's our minimum thickness for our 1.85 rotors. And one slot is 1.7. That's our minimum thickness for our HS2 rotors, as well as a 3 millimeter pad slot. That's the minimum thickness for our brake pads. We also have a rotor measuring gauge on our new universal bleed block. Hopefully you caught that there's a rotor thickness gauge here, as well as a rotor thickness gauge here. So jumping back over here, switch my cameras and share my screen. All right, share my screen here. Switch my camera back. I'll leave the camera there. All right, so jumping on over here, there's a couple key documents, and I'm going to Google search these. You can find these from our tech site, but I just want you guys to know these exist so you can pull them up easily. So let's go SRAM brake tuning. And one of the first things that's going to pop up is our brake tuning guide. And so we can see our lineup of calipers. It's about choosing the right brake, choosing the pads, and then we go look at our rotors. We talk through our options, but this color guide is kind of what I'm looking for here. If we've got that kind of rainbow effect, that purple effect, it means our rotor got so hot that we've probably glazed our brake pads. We probably need new brake pads, probably need new rotors, and definitely want to bleed our brake, but we should be sizing up our rotor here. This rotor is getting too hot. If we see that silver color, it's not ideal. We want to be in that kind of bronzish, kind of toasted marshmallow look here. So when your customer comes in and you're having that brake tuning conversation, take a look at the rotors, measure them for wear, and take a look. Make sure that rider's getting into that kind of optimal heat window. Maybe they want to go down a rotor size. Maybe they want to go from HS2 to centerline. You have a lot of opportunity here to really dial their experience in and improve the performance of their bike without necessarily changing out their calipers, without necessarily changing out to a completely different brake, just dialing in on those. All right, so questions about hoses. I'm going to answer that question. I'll get back to you real quick because I do want to talk about hoses, but let's get through the rest of the rotors and pads. So we've got some changes. So once we've identified the proper rotor for our rider, we can talk about pads. So SRAM brake pad guide, and hopefully you've seen this. So our identification guide is going to pop up, and this is a great one to have bookmarked or possibly printed out and laminated at your service counter. One of the things you see here is we've gone to kind of t-shirt sizing for our brakes. So we've gone to t-shirt sizing for our brakes. Our Mavens are going to use an extra large, which is offered in a couple compounds. Our Motives DB8s are going to be offered in a large, as well as some legacy brakes. Medium, which was our level and G2 and guide, so it's a legacy brake pad size. And on the road side of things, we're going to have small, and we've got a variant of that that's an OE only option, which can be replaced with the regular small. And then we have an asymmetric, which is our Hydro R kind of legacy model, as well as our ball bearing brakes. But basically, we've really simplified our brake size identification tool. You can very easily take a look and figure out what brake size that rider needs based on the caliper. But then once we've identified that, we can dial in our brake pad material to fit that rider's needs. So if we roll on down here, we've got a little guide that shows what each of our brake pad compounds behaves like. And we do at least 2 different brake compounds in each size. Some sizes will actually get 4 different compounds. And so let me zoom this in so it's hopefully a little easier to read for you. Hopefully that's a little better. And so what you see here is a couple different things. You'll see a plus and minus under each of these. So there is no one perfect brake pad compound. And again, the brake pad compound the brake comes with is determined by a product manager. All of our mineral oil brakes are going to come stock with the organic pads at the aftermarket. But there is no perfect brake pad compound. There are pluses and minuses of each of these compounds. And the other thing you see is that rather than talking about these brake pads as organic or sintered, which we do label them as such, we've chosen to label them based on that rider experience. If you're talking to a rider, sometimes organic or sintered might mean something to them, but much more likely that if a rider doesn't care, we can just talk about that ride experience. So for our quiet brake pads, which is an organic compound with a black backing plate, it's a steel backing plate. It's a quiet brake pad. It's going to bed in really quickly. It's going to have great initial bite. But if you're riding opposite side of the spectrum, we've got our heavy duty or sintered brake pads. They're going to have great resistance to friction fade at high heat. They're going to perform really well in wet conditions, but they're going to take longer to bed in. They're not going to have as much initial bite, and they're going to be a little louder if you get them wet. And so we've also got our power pads, which are kind of a split the difference and kind of, jack of all trades brake pad. And then we've got our quiet light, which is the same as our quiet, but with an aluminum backing plate. And so the conversation I might be picturing myself having at the service counter with my rider is what is that rider after, right? If I've got my roadie who's going on group rides, I'm probably going to be setting them up with those quiet brake pads. Nobody wants to be the noisy guy on the group ride. But if I've got my rider who's riding their gravel bike and they're doing something like Unbound and they're worried about wet, muddy conditions, they don't really necessarily care if those brake pads are noisy, if those brake pads are going to get them to the end of the race without issue. So they might actually opt for heavy duty. So again, it's about having a question, it's about having a conversation and figuring out the best pads for that rider. And they may need different pads for different points in the season. Another key thing to remember is brake pads bond to a brake rotor. So if we are changing pad compounds, we are always going to change a rotor because we want to have the pads bedded into the rotor. The only pads we can change without changing pad compound is our quiet and lightweight, because those are the same pad compound. It's just an aluminum backing plate for some weight savings here. So again, great tool to have, great conversation to sort through these. All right, see some questions here. I want to make sure we address these. All right, finally going to address that hose question. One more thing I want to talk about. So we've got another resource that pops up here. If I look up SRAM hose, we have a hose guide that talks you through which hose and helps you identify our different types of hoses. And we do only sell our hoses in those 2,000 millimeter kits. That is the largest quantity we have. The one thing I do want to actually point out to everyone that's maybe not super widely known is that SRAM makes one brake hose. The hose that we're using on our mineral oil Maven, our heaviest duty brake, is the same as the hose we are using on our red lightest weight performance dot fluid brake. Obviously, once a brake fluid has touched that hose is forever married to that brake fluid. But if you've got a hose kit on your wall, it is whatever you decide it is. You'll actually see the silver banjo hose is compatible with as far back as Juicy, as well as our new Maven brakes. The way you're going to make sure that that brake works with the right fluid is it's going to come with a little brown envelope. In that envelope, there's going to be black O-rings for dot fluid and green O-rings for mineral oil. If you had that silver banjo hose on the wall and you snipped the banjo off, it's now a double compression hose, and you can mount it to a road lever. So really simple to ID our hose systems there. Quick question here about going from 1.85 millimeter rotors to 2 millimeter thick rotors. Do we have to reset the calipers with the massage procedure? Yes, you are going to need to push those pistons back into the board to give room. Those 2 millimeter thick rotors will actually work on any of our brakes. I personally, on my gravel bike, I can't put bigger than 160 rotors on there, and I'm a big boy. I'm well over 200 pounds. So I run 2 millimeter thick rotors on my gravel bike, and you will need to reset the pistons and then center those over the new rotor, but you can run a 2 millimeter thick rotor in anything. A good piston press tool for Maven. We do have a new piston press tool, but with Maven having those bolts across the top and not being top loaded, the best tool I've found for pressing pistons in Mavens is a cone wrench. I like to use the rubberized handle of my Park Tool cone wrench as a piston reset. I push it in there nice and level. That's the best tool I've found, but we don't have an official piston press. Got a few more questions. Man, love the engagement, guys. So do we have to change the rotor, or can the rotor be cleaned? No, we have to change the rotor when we change brake pad compounds. The pad compound actually beds itself into the pores of the rotor. That's why it's so important we do a brake bedding process when we have a new set of pads and rotors. And so there is no back and forth. What I would suggest you doing is if you have a rider who changes multiple pads and rotors through the season is Ziploc bags, right? If they're changing for their kind of winter rotor, if they're doing winter riding, put the pads and the rotors in that Ziploc bag together and then put the other pads and rotors on and they can go back and forth. They've got those pads and rotors matched together. And the other thing I would discourage you from taking time to try and clean rotors, it's trying to have some profitability in our service center. And the question, is there a video for the piston massage process? Absolutely. So if we go to our YouTube channel, so we have Stu Online, which is our technical education. If we go to our YouTube channel and we go to, whoa, it's going to start playing something stupid. Tell me about my life insurance. All right, so if I go to SRAM Tech, there's a lot of bad information on YouTube, so making sure we're looking at the official stuff. We have our own SRAM Tech channel, and the piston massage process is going to be up here. So it'll be procedure, and here it's going to be at the end of our piston massage process is right in here. So SRAM Tech is going to be our YouTube channel that's going to have all of those useful resources on it. And let's talk about some other tools here. I want to maximize our time together. Love the questions. Stop sharing my screen here. I'm going to switch cameras on over and talk about a few kind of other things. Right? If our goal is maximizing our service revenue, leaning into that tuning story, asking good questions, looking for that marking on the rotor. When we take a look in the back of our caliper, we can see, I mentioned these colorized backing plates. So you can actually look in the top of a caliper and see what kind of pads that rider is using and have a good conversation without having to pull those out of the caliper. And so here's a caliper with the pads in here. I can tell that this DB8 is set up with our heavy duty sintered pads. If this rider's having, brake noise issues, new rotor plus organic pads are probably going to be a great solution for them. And you'll see our packaging, we're using that extra large sizing with the quiet plus the organic language on there on that pad. So switching my other camera on over here, some other things worth talking about. We do our maximum mineral oil in the 16.9 ounce bottle, but we also do it in the 4 ounce bottle. So we did our dot fluid in the 4 ounce bottle for a number of reasons. With the dot fluid, once the dot fluid was open, that fluid started to absorb moisture. So you didn't want to use a big bulk bottle of dot fluid. With mineral oil, it's not going to absorb moisture, but we still do still do those 4 ounce bottles of this mineral oil. And I would urge you to use this at the service counter. The reason why I like this is it's going to help manage my inventory versus this bulk. But the other way I use this is the conversation I have with my rider. Someone's coming in because they've got a problem with one of their brakes typically, and it needs a bleed. I'm going to sell them the bleed plus this 4 ounce bottle of fluid. And then the conversation I have is this 4 ounce bottle of fluid is more than enough to bleed both of your brakes. That other brake has likely been out on the road for the same amount of time as that first brake that has the issue. Let's address that brake before it develops an issue. You've already purchased the fluid that you need to do that bleed. The setup time and cleanup time for me to do 2 brake bleeds is really no different than the setup time and cleanup time to do 1 brake bleed. So I've made myself more efficient. I've sold the fluid I need, and I've sold 2 brake bleeds rather than 1. So I would urge you to have the bulk bottle just for, stock bikes and things like that, but lean into the 4 ounce bottles at the service counter as a way to drive more brake bleeds and just add profitability to the service counter. I mentioned that piston massage tool that's going to come with our new Mineral Oil Pro bleed kit. That's what that looks like. We can use it in any of our brakes. The other thing in our new bleed kit is we've had a crow foot for the fittings that looked like this. If you tried to use this on our new Road E1 stuff, it was a little fat and it didn't fit in with the handlebar. So we put it on a diet. That's the crow foot that comes with our new mineral oil bleed kit, and it can be used on any of our other brakes. And the other thing in that bleed kit is going to be that Maven spacer that has the rotor thickness gauges, as well as our new universal bleed block, which has the rotor thickness gauges. And with our bleed kit, there's been a couple generations of our bleed kit. There's the non-pro version. There's the first version we did. There's the second version we did. We really upgraded things with the version 3, which uses a metal lure lock, a narrower syringe to draw better vacuum. With our Maven brakes, there's a lot of fluid in that system. There's a large pistons in there. Using the right bleed kit is going to be the key to success, and getting a good bleed is going to be the key to setup there. So I really urge you to use the V3 bleed kit rather than kind of an all one size fits all bleed kit on those. We also have a new piston or press tool, which can be used as a bleed block as well. We're moving away from the million pieces of plastic for bleed blocks. So this is a handy tool to have around the service department. And I mentioned we have one hose. With the hose kits, you're going to get the black O-rings for dot fluid and green O-rings for mineral oil. Green is kind of our color code for mineral oil. It's the color of the fluid. It's the color of the bleed kit. It's the color of the bleeding edge fitting. And it's the color of the O-rings in those hose kits. So switching my camera on over here, checking for more questions. All right, let's charging on down here. Talked about the bulk fluid, talked about, oh, one more thing before I forget. So you've likely got a jar of this in your shop. You may have a really old one with a yellow logo that says Avid and it says dot grease, or maybe you have a slightly old one that says dot grease. If you have a new one, it's going to say this: dot compatible hydraulic disc brake assembly grease. So this is a critical part of our hose cutting process. You're going to want to use it on the compression fitting to get proper torque, and you're going to want to use it on the Stealth-A-Majig barb when we thread that in there so that we don't tear that liner. The reason why we've got a number of different containers is we've changed the language, but we haven't actually changed the formulation. It's that same red grease you've been seeing from us for years. We're going to use this on our dot brakes as well as our mineral oil brakes. Though if you're in a shop where you're kind of dipping your hoses in here, make sure you have a separate one of these for your mineral oil brakes so you're not cross-contaminating. Maybe put a green sticker on it or something like that. But definitely a critical item to have for service. A little goes a long way with this stuff. I don't, I cut hoses all day long, and I don't go through one of these in a year at least. So definitely something we're going to want to have in our service department. The other thing we are going to want is when we take a look at our compression fittings. So our threaded compression fitting, our red compression fitting. So we've been using these for a number of years on our dot fluid brakes. When we introduced our mineral oil lineup, one of our criteria was we didn't want to introduce new SKUs, new part numbers. So these are consistent across our lineup. These are available in 50 packs. I would say it's worth stocking up. A 50 pack is going to go a long way, and it's going to work for any SRAM brake that you're likely to encounter. So definitely something to beef up stock on. The hose kits I mentioned, consistency across those. And then taking a look, I showed you kind of the image up there on the chart, but to show you what these brake pads look like in person so you can ID those backing plates. We've got our quiet organic with a black backing plate. That's what you're going to find as the aftermarket brake pad in all of those calipers. We've got our power, which was the OE brake pad of choice on our previous lineup. So there's a lot of those out in the market. We've got our quiet and light. It's the same pad compound here, just in a lighter backing plate. This is for my rider who's looking to save weight on every little thing. And then we've got our copper backing plate, which is our heavy duty sintered brake pad. Great for wet weather. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, probably the brake pad of choice. If you've got commuters, stocking this compound in the road size is a great choice. So we got a lot of different factors we can play around with there. We can manipulate to make sure we've got the right choice. Jumping on over to my questions. Looks like we got some new questions here. Question here about the seal kits for the plungers of the old Pro Dot fluid bleed kits. We do have a replacement kit, but it's mostly just hoses. Maybe due to replace that bleed kit entirely. I don't think we have the kits, but the new mineral oil kit, you will actually get replacement plunger O-rings. So this In this case, this is a pre-production one. It's red, but this O-ring comes in the new kit. So that bleed kit will give you a long service life here. As far as the old Avid ones, the dot ones, I don't believe those are available as a standalone part anymore. So great question here about that bleed kit. One thing I wanted to mention about the bleed process, I did talk about our lever for our DB4 and DB6. Those are not ambidextrous when we do a bleed. If this is our handlebar, I'm going to rotate this vertical so that bleed port is the highest point in the system. Other than that, we're going to bleed this exactly as we would bleed a Maven, as exactly as we would bleed a Motive, as exactly as we've been bleeding codes for years. So no real changes on that side of things. All right, switching my camera back on over here, checking my list. I think we covered most of what I was hoping to cover. I just wanted to kind of sum some things up as we come to a close here. Just running through my notes. Oh, so yeah, a couple things I wanted to highlight here. Let me share my screen one more time. Almost skipped over that. Bear with me. So we got a couple. I mentioned the piston press. I mentioned the bleed kit. So let's look. Leafy bleed kit. Just so we can ID it. There's whoop. I can't spell. There's two things I wanted to highlight. That bleed kit I wanted to mention, make sure that if you've had challenges with the bleed kit before, that Pro bleed kit really is going to be the game changer, right? It's available with fluid, without fluid. You can see all the other parts I highlighted here. That really is the key to service. You can see those two spare O-rings here for that kit to keep that going for a long service life. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is tackle box, is we do a mineral oil tackle box. If you're getting a lot of our mineral oil brakes in your market, this is something worth investing in, right? Just the brake pads alone, you're going to more than break even on the cost of this. It's going to include a bunch of other small parts that are helpful for service. If you're the kind of shop that loves the tackle box thing, this is a great item to pick up. So question here, how will the newer mineral oil brakes tolerate extreme cold weather? Well, I mean, extreme cold weather is a matter of opinion. I've previously lived in Wisconsin. So mineral oil, that's definitely one of the downsides of a mineral oil brake. Mineral oil does struggle when we get down to low temperatures. The mineral oil we're using from Maxima performs better than most other mineral oils at extreme temperatures. The seals I mentioned, the work we put into those proprietary seals and the calipers are going to be the key. But when we start getting into some extreme conditions, if you're doing the IDITA bike, you may still have challenges with a mineral oil brake versus a dot fluid brake. But for the needs of most riders in most typical environments, it will perform better than most other mineral oil brakes on the lineup out there. Talk through different caliper adapters when we use post brackets versus bolt spacers. Yeah, great question. All the new brakes are going to be not spacers. They're going to be the brackets. Let me pull up the manual real quick here. So our spare parts catalog is going to be a great resource here to take a look at. And I do know that the spacers can be a little confusing. We've gone to post brackets versus those CPS spacers for everything. We really tried to simplify it. So here's our spare parts catalog. We do a new one of these every year. If we go towards the end, the very end of the catalog, we have a guide that's going to be your go-to resource for identifying brake mounts. So there's our hose guide right there. Oh, I went past it. Come on. I had it up 2 seconds ago. Bear with me, bear with me. There's our rotors. Okay, here's our rotor mount chart. So here's what your frame has. Here's the mount you're going to want. So that's going to be your quick answer on that. So it'll be on the SRAM small parts catalog. We went to 2 different adapters based on if you're going from 180 to 200, you're going to want one adapter. If you're going to go from 200 to 220, you want the other adapter. It really should simplify things. Don't worry about those spacers. Don't worry about the CPS stuff anymore. This should really simplify your picture. The 40P adapter still exists, but again, check with your manufacturer to make sure it's acceptable to use a 40P adapter. They're always going to be the final authority on whether or not that's going to do that. Question about recommended service interval for replacing hoses. Typically, hoses don't experience a lot of wear and tear. More often than not, you're replacing hoses because bike fit changes or a hose got caught on something and damaged. We do offer caliper and lever rebuild kits, and we always recommend those as needed. We don't have a recommended service interval for those. So great questions on those. And so we are coming down to the home stretch here. Kind of two things. I just kind of want to sum things up, right? Hopefully you feel like we've got a real simple selling story to talk about that lineup. And hopefully you can see that tuning story as an opportunity for your service department. But the one thing I will say with the tuning story is think about what you've got on the sales floor, think about what you sold last year, and think about what you sold the year before, right? What you put into the market the past 2 to 3 years. Do you have the rotors and pads on your service parts wall to support tuning of those riders' brakes? Because these are going to be essentials. This is going to be an opportunity buy. When someone comes in, you need to have those items on the wall ready to sell and talk to that tuning story. And I think if you get your team on board, it is a real opportunity to grow your work order tickets and ultimately get your riders a better braking experience. And then the final piece, I just want to nail on it one more time. I do think the DB4, DB6, and DB8 have a great amount of opportunity in your market to take care of riders. Everyone wants more confidence braking. They want less hassle with their brake service. And those DB brakes can be an amazing answer in terms of a replacement brake. All right, I'll just pause for a moment there and see if we've got any questions, final thoughts as we kind of bring it into the home stretch. Yeah, great question. Someone asked, hey, there's a 2mm center line. There is a 2mm center line. That's at the 220 level. The center line does go to a 2mm thick rotor, and that's just because we've got so much on that pie plate that we actually need to thicken that rotor up. So in that case, the center line or the HS2 220 is going to give us the heat dissipating paint. So it is going to give us a little bit of boost, but that center line is kind of an outlier in the lineup. So great question on that one. All right, allowing for a few more questions here in the last couple of minutes. Let me drink some coffee.
Just put a couple more in and a couple other ones. A couple people asking about being able to watch this later to review. We will try and get that posted or mailed out to everybody. So TBD on exactly how we share that, but we will work on that for sure on our side. And then in general, I just was going to mention this later, but I'll do it now. For this topic, any other SRAM related topic, RockShox, Zip, Time, Truvative, anything, please reach out if you've got questions or desires for additional training for yourself, for staff who couldn't join us today, for anybody. We want to make sure you guys are getting that. So reach out to your HLC customer service rep, whoever you're talking to your SRAM field guide. If you've already got in touch with them, we want to make sure that that's available for this and any topic. SRAM's amazing. Obviously, you're joining us. You've seen Sean go through it. There's a whole team as well. So please let us know. Please reach out. We want to make sure you guys feel educated and ready to help your customers as best as possible.
Yeah. One final question. Someone asked about DB brakes having a caliper rebuild kit. Yeah, the caliper is actually sharing a lot of architecture with the motive stuff. So yes, you can rebuild a DB caliper. Honestly, don't really see a huge demand for that simply because of where that bike lands price-wise. But you certainly could rebuild that caliper because it shares the pistons and seals as the motive brakes. So that does exist. And Noah asked the question about, everyone seems to love that pad guide. We don't have a printable copy that we can hand out, but it sounds like that's something we need to work on. It is accessible. If you do a quick Google search for SRAM Brake Pad Identification Guide, it'll pop up. You feel free to print that out. Feel free to bookmark that. I will certainly talk with our asset people. It feels like that keeps coming up as a thing that people are looking for at their service counter. All right, I want to thank HLC for having me here today and pulling this all together, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch this, and don't hesitate to reach out again if there are any questions.
So we greatly appreciate it, as always, Sean. We're gonna try and steal as much of your time on a regular basis as we can to go through these topics. I know we've had pretty good feedback on the last version. I think we'll get the same great feedback on this topic. Again, for everybody in attendance, thank you so much for giving us the time. Hopefully, you found this valuable, and we want to keep it up. I know we're also gonna provide a little bit of a bonus on the pricing side of things for all you guys who joined us today. You should see that show up on your accounts on February 1st. So in a couple days, if you're not seeing that, please reach out to customer service and we'll make sure we get you sorted as far as that goes, because we do appreciate it. So yeah, I think we've covered all the questions. We got a couple of thanks posts, so we'll just echo again. And otherwise, we'll let you guys all get back to your day. And if you're in the Carolinas like me, you can get ready for your snowstorm prep, and we'll hopefully it doesn't interrupt the riding too much. So